My dearest dreamers, my name is David, and it's an honor to share this moment with you. Close your eyes, breathe deep, and let love gently infuse every word. Join me in today's story. A billionaire CEO stops his luxury car, hearing a child play in the street. You won't believe what happens next. Julia, a single mother from humble beginnings, faced a constant struggle every day to provide her son, Leo, with the opportunities she never had. From a young age, Leo had shown an unusual talent for music, and his prowess with the violin was evident even without proper professional training. Despite working long hours as a public school teacher and facing debts that seemed to multiply each month, Julia had done everything possible to nurture that talent, sacrificing her own comfort and well-being in the process. The relationship between Julia and Leo was deeply loving, with a connection that went beyond simple coexistence. Julia saw in Leo not just a son, but a reflection of all her unfulfilled hopes and dreams. Her pride in Leo's achievements was immense, but behind every smile lay a backdrop of exhaustion. Unpaid bills, the extra hours she took to cover the costs of music lessons, and the pressure of keeping her home afloat weighed heavily on her. Every night, when Leo fell asleep after practicing, Julia would sit alone at the kitchen table, reviewing accounts that didn't balance, feeling the weight of the world accumulate on her shoulders. However, Julia never let Leo see her distress. To him, she was always the mother who supported him unconditionally, who encouraged him to pursue his dreams despite adversity. Leo's music was what kept her going, what gave her the strength to persevere. But deep down, Julia felt herself nearing a breaking point. Opportunities for musicians like Leo were scarce, and each day that passed without a solution seemed to push her to the limit of what she could endure. Leo's talent had caught the attention of some local music teachers, but without adequate resources, his chances of entering a prestigious academy seemed unreachable. Julia dreamed of offering him that opportunity, but the fear of failure was constant. She knew she couldn't continue indefinitely, but the idea of giving up on Leo's dreams was unbearable. Meanwhile, Leo, though young, seemed to intuit the pressure his mother bore. Sometimes, when he saw Julia tired or worried, he wondered if he should continue pursuing his dream, if perhaps he was asking too much. However, every time he picked up his violin, all his doubts disappeared. Music was the only thing that made the world make sense to him. Julia was a woman who, despite difficulties, had built a life around the hope that her son's talent would provide him with a better future. Although both supported each other, the emotional burden Julia carried on her shoulders could break her at any moment. The night of the charity gala arrived as a last resort for Julia. In a borrowed dress, her heart pounding with nerves, she entered the majestic ballroom, where lights twinkled over a crowd of influential people. She didn't belong in that world. She knew it. But today, it wasn't her own shame or discomfort that worried her, but Leo's future. She knew that if she didn't manage to capture the attention of the night's most important benefactor, Alexander Thorne, opportunities for her son would remain out of reach. Alexander Thorne was a man who commanded respect in high society circles. A self-made millionaire, known for his business acumen and impenetrable coolness. The press described him as distant and calculating, a man who seemed more like a public figure than a real person. Julia had read about him, knew that his tech company had revolutionized the market, and that despite his success, he maintained a very private life. With every step she took towards him at the gala, Julia felt her nervousness increase. The conversations in the ballroom faded as she approached Alexander's tall, elegant figure, who was surrounded by some of the foundation's most powerful donors. She knew that what she was about to do was risky, and breaking into his circle without proper introduction could cost her the only chance she had. But she couldn't afford to fail, not when Leo's future was at stake. Finally, she mustered her courage and pushed her way through the guests until she reached Alexander. He observed her with a slight look of curiosity, but his face remained cold and unreadable. Julia introduced herself in a trembling voice, trying to maintain her composure as she told him about Leo and his extraordinary musical talent. At first, Alexander seemed distracted, as if Julia's words were just background noise amidst the gala's hustle. However, something in Julia's sincerity, in the way she spoke of her son, with a passion bordering on desperation, caught his attention. As she told him about the sacrifices she had made, about Leo's natural talent that had blossomed despite the lack of resources, Alexander paused and truly listened for the first time. The first cracks in his facade of indifference began to appear. Julia's story awakened memories in Alexander of his own past, something he had tried to bury for years. The sacrifices, the lost opportunities, the constant struggle for success at any cost. Although his expression didn't reveal it, inside him was an unexpected emotional resonance. "What you are asking is very difficult," Alexander finally said, in a calm but calculated voice. "There are many talented children who compete for those scholarships." Julia, aware that this might be her only chance, did not back down. She spoke to him with a sincerity and passion that seemed to penetrate the barrier of coldness Alexander had built around himself. "My son is not just talented. He lives for music, and I would give everything for him." Alexander observed her in silence for a moment longer than expected. Julia's words had awakened something within him, an old wound he had avoided confronting for years. Finally, with a brief nod, he told her, "I want to meet your son." That brief moment marked a significant change. Although she didn't know it yet, Julia had achieved something few had. She had touched the heart of a man who had spent years hiding his own emotions under a shell of success and power. Alexander's interest in Leo was not just professional, but personal. And although his motives were not yet clear, even to himself, the first seeds of an unexpected relationship had been planted. As Julia left the gala with a mixture of relief and trepidation, she couldn't help but feel that something bigger was about to begin. Days after the gala, Alexander found himself in a small auditorium, waiting to meet the child prodigy who had captured his attention. By his side, Julia, visibly nervous, tried to remain calm, but couldn't disguise the mixture of anxiety and hope that consumed her. Leo appeared on stage, violin in hand, and a serious look. At 12 years old, he already carried the weight of his mother's expectations, though he had always been able to lose himself in music to make everything else disappear. Alexander observed the boy intently, showing little emotion. For him, this meeting was nothing more than a formal gesture, a promise kept after the emotional encounter with Julia at the gala. However, as soon as Leo began to play, something changed. The sound of the violin filled the hall with an intensity and passion Alexander had not expected. Leo played with a mastery that far surpassed his age. But what impacted him most was the emotional connection conveyed through each note. It wasn't just technical skill, but a genuine dedication to the art, as if the child spoke through his music, as if every chord expressed something words could not. Alexander felt a knot form in his chest. Throughout his life, he had been surrounded by successes and achievements, but Leo's music awakened emotions in him that he thought he had buried long ago. In that moment, he understood that this child was special, not just for his talent, but for the pure passion he radiated. Something in him reminded him of himself when he was young, before the world hardened him. When Leo finished playing, the hall fell silent for a few seconds. Julia looked at Alexander expectantly, but said nothing. Alexander's face remained impenetrable, but his thoughts were in internal chaos. After what seemed like an eternity, Alexander broke the silence. "It's impressive," he said, and in his words there was more sincerity than Julia expected. Leo, accustomed to receiving praise, only nodded shyly. For him, music was something that simply flowed, without the need for explanations or recognition. Alexander, however, saw beyond. He knew that behind that natural talent was an opportunity to mold something great, but he also understood the danger of getting more involved than necessary. In the days that followed, Alexander began to dedicate time to Leo, initially with a professional and detached attitude. He focused on guiding his talent, on providing the resources Julia could not, ensuring the child had access to the best teachers and opportunities. However, with each session, Alexander found himself more and more emotionally involved, something he had not anticipated. The relationship between Leo and Alexander began to grow in an unexpected way. At first, Alexander maintained an emotional barrier, trying to keep interactions strictly musical. But over time, that barrier began to crumble. As he watched Leo improve, as he observed his enthusiasm and dedication, something inside him began to change. The child, with his innocence and love for music, reminded him of something Alexander had lost long ago: the ability to genuinely connect with someone. Every time Leo raised the violin bow, Alexander saw not only the potential of a brilliant musician, but a child who, unknowingly, was teaching him to feel again. However, along with that connection came the ghosts of his past. Each day he spent with Leo forced him to confront memories of his own childhood, of a time when he had been abandoned by his father. Alexander's fear of becoming vulnerable grew stronger. Although he didn't admit it, the possibility of failing as a mentor, or worse, as a paternal figure, tormented him in silence. Meanwhile, Julia, though grateful for everything Alexander was doing for her son, began to notice the tension in him. There were moments when Alexander seemed distant, as if he was struggling with something he didn't want to share. Julia, like Leo, had begun to trust Alexander, but the signs of his internal conflict made her doubt how much she could truly rely on him. Although their relationship was nothing more than that of a grateful mother and a generous benefactor, Julia couldn't help but feel a growing attraction to Alexander, an admiration for his vulnerability hidden beneath that cold facade. One day, after one of the mentoring sessions, Alexander remained in the room long after Leo and Julia had left. Sitting in silence, looking at Leo's violin on the stage, thoughts overwhelmed him. He couldn't keep ignoring the truth. He was starting to care about them, not just as a mentor, but as someone who could have a place in their lives. And that thought terrified him. The conflict within him grew every day. Could he allow himself to lower his guard, to be vulnerable again? Or was it better to walk away before his own fears destroyed what they were beginning to build? As the months passed, the relationship between Alexander and Leo grew closer and closer. What had begun as a simple professional commitment was now something deeper. Alexander was not only Leo's musical mentor. Inadvertently, he had become an important figure in his life. Despite all his success, Alexander had never experienced such a genuine emotional connection with anyone, and that terrified him. Alexander was a man who, from a very young age, had learned to rely only on himself, to emotionally protect himself from pain. His father had left him without explanation, and that wound never fully healed. Since then, Alexander had built his life on foundations of success and control, convinced that he needed no one else. But now, with Leo, all that seemed to crumble. He couldn't stop wondering if he was condemned to repeat his own father's mistakes, to hurt the people he cared about, even unintentionally. This fear became a heavy emotional burden, a shadow that followed him in every interaction with the child. Every time he saw Leo improve and grow under his tutelage, a mixture of pride and fear invaded him. What would happen if one day he failed, if he walked away without explanation, just as his father had done? The possibility of harming Leo paralyzed him, filled him with insecurity. It wasn't just the fear of disappointing him as a mentor, but also the fear of hurting his trust, of failing as someone Leo had begun to see as a paternal figure. Meanwhile, interactions with Julia also became more charged with meaning. From the beginning, their relationship had been professional, based on Julia's gratitude for Alexander's support for Leo. But as he spent more time with them, Alexander began to notice a different connection with her. Julia, though discreet, couldn't hide her admiration and appreciation for him. And little by little, that admiration began to turn into something more. However, both Julia and Alexander remained cautious. Neither dared to take the step towards something deeper, fearful of what that might mean. Julia, still scarred by the difficulties of raising Leo alone, was unsure if she could fully trust Alexander. She knew he carried a complex past, and saw how that past sometimes distanced him, even in the closest moments. For his part, Alexander also felt overwhelmed by the connection he was developing with Julia. He found her incredibly strong, a woman who had made unimaginable sacrifices for her son, and who continued to fight despite adversity. However, his growing affection for her also terrified him. He knew that getting more involved meant opening himself emotionally, something he had avoided his entire life. The fear of repeating his father's mistakes not only affected his relationship with Leo, but also with Julia. Every time he thought about the possibility of getting closer to her, a voice inside him told him to back away, that it was better not to risk it. Despite everything, the connection between them continued to grow. There were moments when the silence between Julia and Alexander was charged with unspoken emotions, with glances that said everything without words. Julia saw the vulnerability in Alexander, something he tried to hide, but that seeped out in small doses whenever he was near Leo. She could see that Alexander was struggling with something internal, and although she didn't fully understand it, she felt a deep empathy for him. One afternoon, after a mentoring session, Alexander was left alone with Leo. As the child played his violin, oblivious to the internal storm raging within his mentor, Alexander found himself observing him with a mixture of pride and fear. Leo was a child full of hope and potential, but in that moment, all Alexander could think was, "What will happen when I disappoint him?" The weight of that question overwhelmed him, and as Leo continued to play, Alexander felt a wave of panic. It wasn't the first time he had felt this emotion, but now it was more intense. Alexander knew he had to make a decision. He had to choose between facing his fear of being vulnerable or walking away before it was too late. Julia, observing from the doorway, felt the change in Alexander's energy. She saw him wrestling with his emotions, but she didn't know how to help him. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that Alexander wouldn't be another man who would enter Leo's life only to then disappear. However, she couldn't help her own doubts. At that moment, Alexander made an internal decision. He knew he had to put up a barrier before things became irreparable. He couldn't allow himself to be emotionally vulnerable. He couldn't risk being another figure of abandonment in Leo's life. The relationship they were building was too valuable to ruin it with his own fears. With a heart full of doubt and a conflicted mind, Alexander left the auditorium that afternoon, feeling more lost than ever. The relationship he had built with Leo and Julia fragile as it was at that moment, was about to face its biggest challenge. Alexander knew that his fear of failure could make him lose everything, but at that instant, he saw no other way out. The ghosts of his past continued to haunt him, and as he walked towards his car, a single question echoed in his mind. Could he really be someone different from his father? Or was he condemned to repeat the same mistakes? Alexander knew that the decision he was about to make would break something in Julia and Leo, but he also believed it was the only way to protect them. For weeks, he had been grappling with the growing fear that his closeness to them would only hurt them in the long run. Memories of his own father abandoning him as a child continued to haunt him. He couldn't allow himself to become another figure Leo idealized, only to then disappoint him. He couldn't risk repeating that cycle. One afternoon, after another mentoring session with Leo, Alexander made a decision. He knew he had to distance himself before his fears completely consumed him and affected others. That same night, without warning or goodbye, Alexander broke all contact with Julia and Leo. A short, cold, and calculated message was all he left them. "It's better we don't continue. I regret any harm caused. I wish you the best." The emotional distance he had built over the years now materialized into a tangible barrier, leaving them behind. For Julia, the impact was devastating. She had begun to trust Alexander, not only as Leo's mentor, but also as someone on whom she, for a brief time, had allowed herself to lean. When she received the message, her first instinct was disbelief. She didn't understand how someone who had been so committed to her son, who had shown genuine interest, could walk away so suddenly. The pain of betrayal struck hard. Julia felt not only abandoned as a mother, but also as a woman. Although she had never verbalized her feelings for Alexander, she had felt a connection with him, a latent hope that perhaps, just perhaps, something more could have blossomed between them. Now, that hope faded, replaced by a feeling of deep emptiness. The following nights became long and silent, with Julia staring at the ceiling, wondering where she had gone wrong. Had she trusted too much? Had she allowed herself to dream of something that was never real? Leo, for his part, experienced the loss differently. It wasn't just a man who had stopped visiting. It was someone Leo had begun to see as a paternal figure, someone who had filled a space in his life he had never known he needed. The child didn't understand why Alexander had left so suddenly. Although Julia tried to explain that it wasn't either of their fault, Leo couldn't help but feel guilty. Had he done something wrong? Had he not been good enough for Alexander to stay? Confusion and pain took hold of Leo, and his music began to reflect that anguish. While before he played with passion and joy, now his notes were more somber, more laden with contained emotion. Julia watched him from a distance, unable to find the right words to comfort her son. She knew Leo was feeling it deeply, but there was nothing she could do to erase the emptiness Alexander had left. Meanwhile, Alexander also suffered in silence. Although he had made the decision to distance himself for what he believed were the right reasons, he couldn't stop thinking about Julia and Leo. Guilt constantly tormented him. He repeated over and over that he had done it to protect them, that by leaving he was preventing both of them from suffering later on. However, a part of him knew that was just an excuse. Every night Alexander found himself thinking about them, wondering how they were doing, how they were coping. Images of Leo playing the violin, with that intensity and passion that had moved him from the beginning, haunted him. He knew there was something special about that child, something he, despite all his success and achievements, had never been able to experience. The feeling of being part of something genuine and pure. However, Alexander's internal demons remained too strong. Every time he considered returning, a voice in his head stopped him. "You're not good enough for them," he told himself. "You'll only hurt them more if you stay." It was the same fear that had followed him all his life, the fear of repeating his father's mistakes. And although he was now a successful, wealthy, and respected man, that fear continued to define many of his decisions. The distance he had created between himself and Julia did not bring him the relief he expected. Instead, he felt increasingly trapped by his own decisions. At social events, where he once found solace in indifference, now he only saw empty faces that meant nothing to him. In his office, where work once distracted him, now there was only an uncomfortable silence. The absence of Julia and Leo in his life was palpable, and although he tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing, he couldn't escape the feeling that he had lost something irreplaceable. From a distance, Alexander remained attentive to Leo's progress, ensuring he received the best opportunities. Financially, he continued to support his musical education, although Julia and Leo didn't know he was behind it all. But that support from the shadows didn't fill the emotional void he felt. He stayed close enough to know that Leo was well, but never close enough to become part of their lives again. Time passed, but the pain and guilt remained. For Julia, the betrayal became a deep wound, one more in a life already marked by constant struggles. For Leo, the confusion persisted, but little by little, he learned to play his violin with the same passion as before, though now his notes seemed to be tinged with a premature emotional maturity. And for Alexander, the distance he had imposed only made the weight of his decisions sink him deeper into the solitude he had ironically tried to avoid. He was convinced that his departure had been for the best, but the emotional connection he had formed with Julia and Leo didn't disappear, and although he was no longer part of their lives, he could never fully escape them. A year had passed since Alexander left Julia and Leo's lives, and although time had moved on, the scars his departure left were still present in both of them. During that time, Leo had achieved something that seemed impossible. He had won a full scholarship to study at a prestigious music academy. It was Julia's dream come true, and although Leo didn't know it, Alexander had been the anonymous benefactor who had made it possible. For Julia, that year had been a constant test of strength. From the day Alexander left, she had focused on the only thing that had always kept her steady, her son's well-being. Leo had grown emotionally. He was no longer the naive child who had begun his musical journey. Despite his success, something in him had changed. Although he never openly spoke about Alexander, Julia knew that his absence continued to affect him. The music sessions at home had lost some of the joy they once radiated, and although Leo tried to hide it, the pain of having lost someone he saw as a paternal figure still lingered. Julia, for her part, strove to be the strong and resilient mother she had always been. She knew Leo needed her, and she couldn't afford to fall into a pit of melancholy. However, on quiet nights, when the day's bustle faded and responsibilities ceased, the void Alexander had left emerged powerfully. It wasn't just about the impact his departure had had on Leo, but also about the emotional space he had occupied in her own life. Julia had started to trust him, to open up emotionally, something she hadn't done in years. And his abrupt departure had rekindled old fears of abandonment. Throughout that year, Julia had moments of doubt. Sometimes she wondered if Alexander would return, if he would someday cross the threshold again and explain why he had left. Other times, she simply tried to forget, convincing herself that it wasn't worth continuing to think about someone who had decided not to be part of their lives. But deep down, that unanswered question always remained, that feeling that there was something more behind his departure that she couldn't understand. Meanwhile, Alexander continued to grapple with his own demons, observing from the shadows as Leo grew and became the musician he had always known he would be. Through academy reports and connections with teachers, Alexander kept abreast of Leo's progress, ensuring he never lacked anything. However, that self-imposed distance gnawed at him. He had done everything possible to convince himself that his departure had been the right thing, that distancing himself would protect Julia and Leo from suffering later on. But with each achievement Leo reached, Alexander felt a mixture of pride and pain. Seeing Leo from a distance reminded him of what he had lost, what he had abandoned. He knew he could never return to their lives in the same way, not after having left them so abruptly. But at the same time, he couldn't completely pull away. There were nights when he wondered what would have happened if he had had the courage to stay, to face his fears, and become the paternal figure Leo had needed. However, fear was still there, constant, reminding him that he was nothing more than a shadow of what his father had been. And he feared, more than anything, repeating those same mistakes. Julia had tried to continue with her life, focusing on Leo's success and maintaining an appearance of stability. In public, she always smiled when others congratulated her on her son's achievements. However, there were times when loneliness overwhelmed her. Although there were friends and family around her, the space Alexander had left seemed irreplaceable. She didn't fully understand it, but his departure had rekindled an emotional wound that was slow to heal. Leo, for his part, had found a way to process his emotions through music. Although he had matured and achieved great things at the academy, his music reflected a touch of melancholy. The pieces he used to play with joy and enthusiasm now had an emotional depth that wasn't there before. Although his talent continued to grow, those close to him, including his teachers, noticed that something had changed in his interpretation. Leo played with the weight of someone who had lost something important, although he never talked about it. As the year drew to a close, Julia, Leo, and Alexander continued on, each dealing with the silence and pain in their own way. But although none would admit it, they all knew that the scars of the past were still far from healing. The day of Leo's performance at the prestigious music academy had arrived, and the auditorium was filled with influential people, renowned musicians, and academy directors from all over the country. For Julia, it was a moment of pride, but also nerves. Despite everything that had happened, Leo had managed to get this far, and that night represented one of the most important opportunities of his life. However, a part of her couldn't help but feel that something was missing, or rather, someone. Shortly before the event began, Julia received a special invitation to sit in one of the front rows of the auditorium. She wasn't sure who had sent it, but she accepted gratefully, not imagining what would come next. As she settled in, her gaze swept across the auditorium, where golden lights shone over the heads of the guests. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. There was no trace of Alexander, at least not that she knew of. What Julia didn't know was that Alexander was there, in the last row of the auditorium, in the shadows, trying not to draw attention. He had heard about Leo's performance and knew he couldn't miss it, though his heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and guilt. Throughout the year, he had followed Leo's progress in secret, supporting him from the shadows. But this was the first time in a long time that he would see him in person. He knew his presence was a risk, that Julia might see him and not know how to react. But he couldn't stay away. When the auditorium lights dimmed and Leo appeared on stage, the air in the room became expectant. Julia watched him, her heart swollen with pride. Her son, at 13, seemed to be in perfect harmony with his violin. Dressed in an elegant black suit, Leo looked serene, But Julia knew that beneath that calm was intense emotion, the same emotion he poured into his music. Tonight, Leo would perform a piece he had worked on for months, a piece full of passion and melancholy, reflecting not only his growth as a musician, but also his emotional evolution after Alexander's departure. From the back row, Alexander could barely contain his emotions. As Leo played, each note resonated deep within his being. Leo's music had an almost supernatural quality, a mix of youth and wisdom that moved him in a way he didn't expect. The notes coming from the violin seemed to tell a story of loss, hope, and a silent yearning, a story Alexander felt he himself had influenced in some way, though he didn't want to admit it. As the piece reached its climax, Alexander felt his impenetrable facade begin to crack. The child he had left behind had not only grown, he had blossomed, and each note made him feel both pride and guilt. There was no doubt that Leo was a prodigy, but the melancholy that permeated his performance reminded him that his departure had left a deeper mark than he had imagined. When Leo played the last note, the auditorium erupted in applause. The audience rose, celebrating the young prodigy's incredible performance. Julia also stood, applauding with tears in her eyes. But it was at that moment when she saw him. Among the standing crowd, a familiar face appeared from the shadows. Alexander, standing in the last row, applauded with contained intensity, his eyes filled with an emotion he could barely disguise. Time seemed to stop when their eyes met. The surprise on Julia's face was immediate, but there was also something more, a mix of confusion, tension, and a wave of emotions she hadn't felt in a long time. Alexander's presence, after so long, hit her like an unexpected wave. All the feelings she had buried over the past year began to surface, and the auditorium, with all its bustle, faded around her. Alexander, for his part, felt the weight of the silence between them break at that instant. He knew he couldn't keep hiding. His gaze towards Julia was a silent apology, a plea for understanding, but also a sign that, despite the distance, their connection had never truly broken. He knew there were no words that could erase the pain he had caused, but being there, facing her, was his way of showing that finally, he was willing to face the consequences of his departure. As the auditorium began to empty, and Leo received congratulations from the audience, Julia stood still for a moment, still processing what had just happened. Alexander had returned, and the reunion she had feared, but also longed for, was finally happening. Julia found herself in the lobby, her heart pounding, as she watched Leo receive compliments from his peers and teachers. However, her mind was elsewhere, on the familiar figure she had seen in the last row, Alexander. As the crowd dispersed, Julia felt the tension build in the air. Then, from among the people, she saw Alexander approach, his expression a collage of nervousness and determination. When their eyes met, the world around them seemed to vanish. That connection they once shared, despite months of separation, resurfaced like a powerful current. "Julia," Alexander began, his voice trembling but firm. "I know this is unexpected. I don't know where to start, but I feel I must explain why I left. I left because I was afraid," Alexander continued, his gaze fixed on her. "Afraid of repeating myself, of becoming my father. I didn't want to hurt you or Leo. I thought it was for the best. But I've realized it was a mistake I cannot change." Julia felt the truth in his words, a truth that resonated in her own heart. Alexander's absence had left a void she had tried to fill with work and dedication to her son, but the loss was always present. Still, the pain she had felt from his departure was hard to ignore. Her gaze remained on him, searching for answers in those eyes she had once come to admire. "And what do you expect now?" Julia asked, her voice stronger than she felt. She wanted to show him she wasn't willing to be carried away by emotion, but deep down, her heart beat with equal parts hope and fear. Alexander took a step forward, the air between them charged with tension. "I want a second chance. I want to be part of Leo's life, and if you allow me, I also want to be part of yours. I don't promise to be perfect, but I will try." The sincerity in his words touched something deep in Julia. However, she couldn't allow her emotions to overpower her. Distrust sprang from her wound, reminding her how painful it had been to lose him without an explanation. "I can't forget what happened, Alexander," she said, fighting back the tears that threatened to well up. "I can't just let everything go back to how it was." He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know. I don't expect you to forget. But what I feel for you, and what I feel for Leo, is real. I've been silent, but I haven't stopped thinking about you. I've never stopped worrying about what has happened to you." "I'm not sure if I can trust you again, Alexander," she finally admitted, her voice trembling with the sincerity of her internal struggle. "I understand," he replied, and his voice sounded broken, but firm. "I'm not asking you to forgive me immediately, or to accept me back. I just want you to know that I'm here, willing to fight for whatever might emerge between us, for whatever might emerge for Leo." The tension was palpable, a thin thread connecting their hearts despite the pain and distance, despite the fear. There was something in Alexander's return that ignited a small flame of hope. Perhaps we can try," she finally said, her words full of doubts, but also of determination. "But it won't be easy. We'll need time, and you'll have to earn my trust again." Alexander smiled, and for a moment, the shadow of guilt he had carried for so long seemed to vanish. "I will. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." "I won't return yet, Alexander," Julia began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm willing to give you a second chance, but I must make it clear that I cannot afford another abandonment, not just for me, but for Leo." Alexander looked at her with intensity, feeling Julia's vulnerability touch him deeply. He had waited for this moment, but he couldn't help his heart from filling with a mixture of relief and anxiety. He knew that trust had been lost, but he also understood that he had to earn that second chance. "I understand, Julia. I don't want you to think I'll run away again," Alexander replied, his voice full of sincerity. "I've been silent for so long, struggling with my own fears. But now that I'm here, I want to be part of your lives genuinely. I'm ready to face what comes." Julia observed him intently, looking in his eyes for a sign that he was serious. The determination on his face gave her a little hope, but doubts still persisted in her heart. If all went well, Alexander could be a positive influence in Leo's life. "I promise I'll be honest with you. I don't want to cause you any more pain, neither you nor Leo. I want to help heal the wounds of the past." Leo, who had been at a safe distance, watched the two important figures in his life, feeling that the moment unfolding was crucial. Although he couldn't hear the words they exchanged, his mother's and Alexander's body language told him everything he needed to know. With his heart pounding, Leo approached them, feeling his presence was necessary. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and anxiety. The idea of Alexander being part of his life again excited him, but also filled him with doubts. Could he trust him again? Julia smiled softly at her son, feeling that this moment was a turning point for everyone. "Yes, honey, everything's fine. We're just talking about how we can move forward together." Alexander knelt to Leo's level, feeling it was important to include him in the conversation. "Leo, I want you to know that I'm here because I care about you, and I want to support you in your music and in your life. I'm willing to do it the right way, as a friend first, and, if you wish, as a figure who can help you." Okay, I guess you could try being my friend. I just want you to know it's hard to forget you." Leo's sincerity touched Alexander's heart, who felt a lump form in his throat. "I understand, Leo. I'd like you to give me the opportunity to show you I can be better." Over time, as they continued talking and sharing their feelings, the atmosphere grew lighter. Laughter began to emerge, and the connection that had once been marked by pain now began to be filled with possibilities. Julia felt that, although the past could not be erased, the future could be built with love and honesty. The family, though redefined, began to find its way. Despite the scars of the past, everyone was willing to try. The connection between them, though fragile, felt renewed, full of promises of a better future. If this story of love and transformation captivated you, you're in the right place. Here, every day, we share stories that will make you laugh, cry, and above all, believe in the power of love and humanity. Can you imagine how many more stories like Julia and Alexander's are waiting for you? Don't miss the next one. Join our community of dreamers and romantics. Click the subscribe button and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our exciting stories. The months that followed the reunion in the auditorium were a journey of healing and growth for Julia, Alexander, and Leo. Life, though imperfect, had begun to transform into a beautiful amalgamation of love, support, and second chances. Alexander had committed to being a paternal figure in Leo's life, a role he embraced with tenderness and determination. He presented himself not only as a musical mentor, but also as a friend and an emotional support in the young man's growth. The relationship between the three had evolved in unexpected ways. Julia, initially cautious, found herself rediscovering in Alexander the ability to love and trust again. As both shared their vulnerabilities, their stories of pain and sacrifice, the connection they had forged grew stronger. Leo, with his musical talent blossoming, found in Alexander not only a mentor, but also a figure who inspired him to be his best self. Practice sessions became sacred moments where Alexander not only taught technique, but also shared life lessons. Laughter resonated in the air, and rehearsals were filled with a sense of community they hadn't experienced in a long time. There were days when Alexander wondered if he could truly be the man Leo needed. But with each small step forward, and with each look of trust Julia offered him, he began to realize that he was not alone on this journey. Everyone was learning to be a family again, and open communication became fundamental to their relationship. Julia found comfort in the fact that she was not alone in raising Leo. Alexander, with his unconditional support, gave her the strength she had been looking for years. Together, they began to create new family traditions, from family dinners to outdoor excursions, filled with laughter and deep conversations. Life felt more complete, richer, and although the shadows of the past still existed, the light of hope shone more brightly. Time passed, and as the sun set on the horizon, the three found themselves at home, surrounded by music, laughter, and a sense of belonging. In the life they had begun to build, each of them had learned the value of forgiveness and the importance of giving second chances. In the warmth of her home, Julia looked at Leo and Alexander, and in her heart, she felt that although life might continue to be imperfect, the future was promising. They had faced their demons, and together, they had created a new beginning. Looking ahead, they knew that the bonds they had formed were stronger than any challenge they might face. The family they were forming, though full of nuances, was a testament to their ability to love and overcome pain, a reminder that even in the most difficult circumstances, there is always room for forgiveness and hope. The night slowly fell over the city, and the lights of the buildings twinkled through the windows of Anastasia's apartment. Julian and Martina slept soundly, exhausted after a day full of games and laughter in the park. Silence filled the room, except for the faint sound of the wind blowing outside. Anastasia, sitting on the sofa with a cup of tea in her hands, looked out the window, lost in thought. Adrian sat at the other end of the room, nervous. For weeks he had been looking for the right moment to talk to her, to open his heart and confess everything he had been holding back. But now, with her in front of him, the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. "Anastasia," he finally said, his voice breaking the silence. "There's something I need to tell you." She turned her head, surprised by the serious tone of his voice, and looked at him directly. His eyes, dark and sincere, showed a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "I'm listening," she replied, positioning herself to give him her full attention. Adrian took a breath, searching for the right words. "I know I can't erase what happened, and I know I've made unforgivable mistakes, but what I feel for you has never changed. From the moment I met you, I knew you were different, that there was something about you that I couldn't find in anyone else." Anastasia kept her gaze fixed on him, trying to control the emotions that were beginning to stir inside her. It wasn't the first time she had heard beautiful words, but something in Adrian's tone, in the sincerity it reflected, made her heart beat faster. "Adrian, I don't know if I can believe what you say. I spent years alone, raising our children without your support. I felt invisible to you, as if we had never meant anything." Her voice broke at the end, betraying the strength she tried to project. Adrian leaned forward, desperate to make her understand. "I don't want you to feel that ever again. I know I failed you, and I don't expect you to forgive me immediately. But I want you to know that every day since you came back into my life, I've tried to be better, not just for Julian and Martina, but also for you. Because I still love you, Anastasia. I've always loved you." The words floated in the air, loaded with weight and meaning. Anastasia looked away, feeling tears fill her eyes. She had waited so long to hear something like this, but doubt and fear were still present, reminding her how much she had suffered. "Loving isn't always enough, Adrian. Trust breaks. Wounds leave scars. I don't know if I can trust you again in the same way." Adrian nodded slowly, accepting her words. "I understand, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to show you that you can trust me again. I know it won't be easy, but I'm here, willing to fight for you, for our family, for what we could be." Anastasia looked at him again, seeing the intensity in his eyes. Something inside her, a corner she had kept protected, began to yield. Although her fears were still there, the love that had never completely disappeared was also born. "I promise you nothing," she finally said in a whisper, "but I'm willing to try to open that door, little by little." The smile that illuminated Adrian's face was one of pure gratitude. It wasn't a promise of eternal love, but it was a beginning, and for him, that was enough. Without another word, he sat beside her on the sofa, letting the silence speak for them. It was a silence filled with hope, unresolved emotions, and the possibility of a future together. That night, under the glow of the city lights, something changed between them. Although the road ahead was long, the spark that still burned in their hearts began to grow, illuminating the first step towards a new opportunity for love. The air was heavy, charged with tensions that even the passing days couldn't dispel. Although Adrian had gradually begun to win Anastasia's trust and his children's acceptance, the echoes of the past remained, haunting every new step towards the future. One afternoon, while Anastasia was picking up the children from school, she received an unexpected message on her phone. Upon opening it, a knot formed in her stomach. It was a photo of Adrian with Elena at what appeared to be a private meeting. The image, taken from an intentionally ambiguous angle, was accompanied by an anonymous message. "Do you really believe he has changed?" Anastasia felt the ground beneath her feet tremble. Although in recent months Adrian had proven to be a different man, doubt again settled in her mind, reminding her of the pain she had endured in the past. She put her phone in her bag, striving to maintain her composure in front of Julian and Martina, who were running towards her with their backpacks full of drawings and childhood dreams. That night, while the children slept, Anastasia confronted Adrian. Sitting in the small living room, the atmosphere between them was tense. "I received this," she said, showing the photo on her phone screen. Her voice was low but firm, reflecting the mix of emotions that overwhelmed her. "What does it mean, Adrian?" He took the phone and looked at the image in silence. His normally controlled face showed a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "This isn't what it looks like, Anastasia. Yes, I met with Elena, but it had nothing to do with us. She wanted to discuss pending business matters about the company, and I agreed because I thought it was the right thing to do. There's nothing more." "And why didn't you tell me?" Anastasia asked, her gaze fixed on him. "How do you expect me to trust you if you hide things like this?" Adrian let out a deep sigh, understanding the impact of his decision. "You're right. I should have told you. I didn't want to worry you, but that doesn't justify my lack of transparency. I promise I won't make that mistake again." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, but Anastasia still felt the weight of her own insecurities. "It's not just about this photo, Adrian. It's everything we've been through, everything I still haven't managed to overcome. Every time it seems like we're moving forward, something like this reminds me why I built these barriers in the first place." Adrian nodded, knowing that words alone weren't enough to repair what was broken. In the days that followed, Adrian redoubled his efforts to demonstrate his commitment. He began by being more open, sharing every detail of his meetings and important decisions with Anastasia. He also organized a special family outing, taking them to a small country house where Julian and Martina spent hours playing in a nearby lake, while he and Anastasia watched from a safe distance. "Those two have your energy," Adrian commented, breaking the silence between them as he pointed to the children. Anastasia smiled, though her expression remained cautious. "They are the best reminder of what's worth fighting for," she replied, her tone loaded with meaning. Later, during dinner at the country house, Adrian did something unexpected. In front of Anastasia and the children, he apologized again for all the mistakes of the past. It wasn't a rehearsed gesture or a grand declaration, but a sincere acknowledgement of his failures and a renewed commitment to the future. "I know I can't change the past, but I want you to know that I'm here to stay, no matter what. I don't want you to ever feel again that you can't count on me." Martina, with the innocence of her 5 years, took her father's hand and squeezed it, while Julian, more reserved but equally happy, nodded with a shy smile. Anastasia, though still conflicted, felt a small crack in her defenses begin to widen. A week later, Elena unexpectedly reappeared at Valdivia Holdings' offices, attempting to reclaim her influence over Adrian. However, this time was different. Adrian confronted her with calm firmness, making it clear that their personal and professional relationship had definitively ended. "Elena, I appreciate what you did for the company in the past, but I will not allow you to continue interfering in my life," he said, his voice sharp but respectful. "I wish you the best, but this is the last conversation we'll have on this subject." Elena, unable to hide her surprise, left, knowing she had lost any control she once had over him. When Adrian told Anastasia this that night, she couldn't help but be impressed. Although doubts still lingered in her mind, she couldn't deny that he was doing everything possible to show her that he had changed. Finally, during a sunset walk with the children, Anastasia and Adrian lagged behind, while Julian and Martina frolicked down a path. The golden sunlight illuminated their faces, and the fresh air brought with it a sense of calm. "I've been thinking a lot about all this," Anastasia said, breaking the silence. "And although I'm still afraid, I'm starting to believe we can make it work." Adrian stopped, surprised but hopeful. "Really?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Anastasia nodded, looking at the children before returning her attention to him. "It won't be easy, but I'm willing to try. For them, and for us." Adrian took her hand carefully, as if afraid to break the moment. "Thank you, Anastasia. I'll do everything I can not to disappoint you." As they continued walking, Julian and Martina's laughter filled the air, a reminder of what they had built together. And for the first time in years, both felt that the future belonged to them. The country house Adrian had rented for that special night was decorated with a simple yet warm touch. Warm lights hung in the garden, illuminating the outdoor table, adorned with wildflowers and aromatic candles. Julian and Martina romped among the nearby trees, their laughter mingling with the soft whisper of the wind. For Adrian, this night meant more than just a simple dinner. It was the moment he would finally take a decisive step towards the family he dreamed of building. Anastasia arrived with the children, wearing a simple yet elegant dress that highlighted her natural beauty. As she crossed the threshold of the garden and saw the effort Adrian had put into every detail, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of awe and emotion. Her heart, though still cautious, began to beat faster. "This is beautiful, Adrian," she said, her voice soft as she surveyed the scene. Adrian, nervous but determined, approached and smiled. "It's for you all. I want tonight to be special, like a new beginning." The dinner unfolded in a relaxed atmosphere. The children, fascinated by the lights and the food, filled the table with laughter and innocent comments. Adrian made sure to include their favorite dishes, a detail that did not go unnoticed by Anastasia. Every gesture, every word, reinforced the idea that he was committed not only to her, but to the entire family. When dessert was finished, Adrian rose from his chair and asked for everyone's attention. Julian and Martina looked at him with curiosity, while Anastasia watched, surprised by the sudden change in his tone. "I want to say something important," he began, looking at Anastasia and then at the children. "These past few months have been the most meaningful of my life. I have learned that family is not something to be taken for granted, but something that is built with love, effort, and commitment. And you are my family." He paused, reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket for a small velvet case. Opening it, he revealed a simple yet meaningful ring. "Anastasia, I made many mistakes in the past, but everything I have done since you returned to my life has been to show you that I want to be with you, not just as the father of our children, but as your partner, your support, and someone you can trust." He knelt before her, taking her hand. Anastasia's eyes filled with tears, while the children watched with a mixture of emotion and awe. "Will you marry me?" Adrian asked, his voice trembling slightly, but laden with sincerity. The silence that followed was brief, but intense. Anastasia looked at the ring, then at Adrian, and finally at Julian and Martina, who seemed to be holding their breath. In their faces, she saw not only Adrian's hope, but also that of her children, who dreamed of a complete family. With a smile that illuminated the entire garden, Anastasia nodded. "Yes, Adrian. Yes, I will marry you." The children's joy was immediate. Julian jumped from his chair and hugged his mother, while Martina clung to Adrian's neck, laughing with a pure, childlike happiness. Adrian, unable to contain his emotion, stood up and hugged Anastasia. feeling every barrier between them finally crumbling. After dinner, while the children played near the lake illuminated by the moon, Adrian and Anastasia sat together, watching them in silence. Adrian took Anastasia's hand, lacing their fingers together. "Thank you for giving me this chance," he said, his voice low but full of emotion. "I promise I won't fail you." Anastasia looked at him, seeing in his eyes a sincerity she hadn't seen before. Although there were still wounds to heal, for the first time she felt she could fully trust him. "I know, Adrian. That's why I said yes." The night ended with a family hug under the stars. In that moment, with Julian and Martina nestled between them, Adrian and Anastasia felt they had finally found the place where they belonged, together. As a family united by love and the determination to overcome any challenge the future might bring. The sun shone softly on the gardens of the small estate where the wedding would be held. The ceremony had been carefully planned, not with ostentation, but with a warmth that reflected the essence of the family Anastasia and Adrian were forming. Wildflowers adorned the improvised altar, while white wooden chairs lined the lawn, occupied by close friends and family who had accompanied the couple on their journey. Martina and Julian, dressed carefully, ran among the guests, their laughter filling the air with joy. Martina held a small bouquet of daisies, and Julian, with a solemn bearing that contrasted with his natural mischief, carried the rings on a velvet cushion. For them, this day was more than a celebration. It was the promise of a complete home, full of love and security. Anastasia, wearing an elegant lace dress, walked towards the altar with a serene smile. Her gaze sought Adrian, who waited for her with eyes full of emotion. In that moment, all the doubts and fears of the past vanished. The man who now stood before her had shown through actions, not just words, that he was willing to build a solid future for them. The ceremony was brief, but deeply emotional. When it was time for the vows, Adrian took Anastasia's hand and spoke with a firm voice, but full of feeling. "Before our children, our friends, and our family, I want to promise you something more than love. I promise to care for you, respect you, and build with you a home where we can always be ourselves. I promise to be the father Julian and Martina deserve, and the partner you need." Anastasia, with tears in her eyes, responded with a trembling voice but full of conviction. "Adrian, today I not only accept you as my husband, but as the man with whom I want to share everything we are and everything we will be. I promise to trust you, support you, and love you, not only on happy days, but also on difficult ones, because together we are stronger." Applause erupted as Adrian and Anastasia exchanged rings. Martina, excited, ran towards them, wrapping them in a hug, while Julian, more contained but equally happy, joined with a wide smile. In that moment, all four were complete, united by a bond that time had tested, but that was now stronger than ever. The reception, though simple, was filled with genuine laughter and joy. The children ran among the tables, sharing games with other little guests, while the adults toasted the happiness of the newlyweds. Adrian and Anastasia shared a first dance under the warm lights hanging from the trees, surrounded by emotional gazes. "Do you remember the first time we danced?" Adrian asked, smiling as he held Anastasia close. "I remember," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "I never imagined we'd end up here, but I'm grateful we made it." He looked at her tenderly, acknowledging the truth in her words. They had traveled a path full of obstacles, but that journey had led them to the exact moment where both needed to be. That night, when the celebration ended, the family returned home, exhausted but happy. Martina fell asleep in Adrian's arms, while Julian, with heavy eyelids, whispered, "Daddy, this was the best wedding in the world." Adrian smiled, kissing his son's forehead, before putting him to bed. When they finally reunited in the living room, Anastasia and Adrian shared a moment of silence, watching how the home they had built was full of life and love. "This is all I ever wanted," Anastasia said, her voice barely a whisper. "And I will never stop being grateful that you gave me this opportunity," Adrian replied, wrapping her in a protective embrace. The days that followed were a reflection of the new stage they were beginning. Mornings were filled with laughter and the hustle and bustle of the children getting ready for school. Afternoons were divided between homework and games in the park, while evenings ended with stories shared around the table. There was something deeply satisfying in the simplicity of their life together, something both had learned to value after all they had been through. In their new home, the walls were adorned with Julian and Martina's drawings, and the bookshelves began to fill with photos capturing happy moments, their first family outing, the children's birthday, and now, their wedding. Each image was a testament to what they had overcome and what they had created together. A year had passed since that magical night, when Anastasia and Adrian officially united their lives. The family home, located in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by lush trees and colorful gardens, overflowed with life and joy. Mornings began with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of birds singing, mingled with the laughter and conversations of Julian and Martina as they prepared for school. Adrian, who used to be the first to wake up, enjoyed those quiet moments before the house came alive. He watched Anastasia sleep peacefully, her face illuminated by the soft morning light, and felt immensely grateful for the second chance life had given him. Every day was a reminder of how lucky he was to have such a wonderful family. Anastasia, for her part, had found in Adrian not only a partner, but a true support in all facets of her life. They had learned to communicate openly, to face challenges together, and to celebrate triumphs, however small. Their love had grown stronger, becoming an unbreakable bond that gave them the confidence to look towards the future with hope. Weekends were especially significant for the family. They often organized excursions to the countryside, where Julian and Martina could run free, explore nature, and give free rein to their innate curiosity. Adrian taught them to fish in the nearby lake, while Anastasia prepared a picnic with their favorite foods. These moments, simple but profound, became cherished memories they would treasure forever. One afternoon, as the sun set, painting the sky with orange and pink hues, the family sat around a bonfire. Julian, with his bright eyes, asked, "Daddy, how did you know Mommy was the person you wanted to be with forever?" Adrian smiled, looking at Anastasia tenderly. "Because when I'm with her, I feel like I'm home, no matter where we are. Your mother has the ability to make everything around her better, and I can't imagine my life without her." Martina, snuggled next to Anastasia, added, "And we're part of that love, right?" Anastasia kissed her daughter's forehead. "Of course, my love. You are the best result of our love, and you teach us every day what truly matters." The comfortable silence that followed was filled with understanding and connection. The family looked at the stars that began to appear, feeling that, in that instant, everything was in its place. In the community, Adrian and Anastasia's story had become a source of inspiration. Many knew the obstacles they had overcome and saw in them an example of how love and perseverance could transcend any barrier. Even Elena, who had disappeared from their lives, seemed now only a distant memory that had lost its power over them. Adrian had found a balance between his professional and personal life. He had reorganized his priorities, delegating more responsibilities at work to dedicate quality time to his family. Anastasia, for her part, had resumed personal projects she had postponed, always with Adrian's unconditional support. One night, while they looked through a photo album that chronicled their journey so far, Anastasia reflected aloud. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Adrian nodded, lacing his fingers with hers. "And every step has been worth it. I wouldn't change anything we lived through, because it has brought us here." She looked him in the eyes, finding in them the same sparkle that had captivated her from the beginning. "Me neither. The important thing is that we are together, and that we will continue building our story, day by day." They kissed softly, sealing once more the commitment they had to each other. Adrian and Anastasia's love had proven to be stronger than any adversity. Together they had created a home where trust, respect, and joy reigned. Julian and Martina grew up surrounded by that love, learning from their parents the value of honesty and the importance of fighting for what one believes in. Thus, the family continued to move forward, sure that no matter what the future held, they would face it all together. Their story was proof that true love not only overcomes obstacles, but grows stronger with them, becoming an eternal bond that transcends time and circumstances. If this story of love and transformation captivated you, you're in the right place. Here, every day, we share stories that will make you laugh, cry, and above all, believe in the power of love and humanity. Can you imagine how many more stories like Julia and Alexander's are waiting for you? Don't miss the next one.